All right, welcome to YWR. Got a special guest today, Marvin Barth. We're gonna talk about um, global decay, chaos, World War III, and hedging the unhedgeable. These are all the big, difficult topics that are actually becoming the elephant in the room and are actually very relevant today. And I think they're so difficult that I think most investment committees and funds just don't even know where to start with this topic. And actually, fortunately, we found Marvin, who's done incredible work on this. And I've spent the last week and a half talking with him and reading his work on this, and it's amazing. And so, Marvin, welcome to YWR.
Well, it's my pleasure, Eric, and thank you for having me on. And I've enjoyed our discussion so far, so I'm looking forward to this.
So, Marvin, I had to set this up for everyone else. I had someone on. It was David Quinn. He had a kind of non-consensus poll, and we did a podcast, and he had this kind of non-consensus view about how the market goes higher. And one of the YWR readers reached out and he goes, "Well, that was really interesting, very individual thinker. I enjoyed that." And he go, "But you know who you should really get on is this guy Marvin Barth." And I was like, "Who's Marvin Barth?" And they go, "Check it out, man." And so then I started reading about you, reading your posts and your Substack, thematic markets. And then I saw your podcast with, I think, Tim McGrath from State Street about stablecoins.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh God, this guy is really." I love it. I love how he thinks. I love your work and everything you were thinking about stablecoins. And so that kind of, I was like, wow, yeah, he would be a great fit. And you've written about a lot of things. But first I want to, let's introduce yourself, because I think you have a great, a really amazing background in terms of the different institutions you worked in, and also that it's a mix of both educational or like institutional, but government, but also you've been in the macro world, so how that, like kind of all the sides of the, all the players. So do you want to just tell us your, kind of your quick?
Well, I think I need to hire you for my advertising, because that's literally exactly how I describe myself. Is that my sort of advantage in the world, as I see it, is that I have looked at the world from so many different perspectives that so few other people have. So, yeah, I'm trained as a PhD economist. I was trained to be an academic, but I worked in the Fed. I worked in the international market section. Yeah, and so I was covering global financial markets there. Reporting to the board in written reports every day. I was briefing the board at least once a month. Being the direct first line of defense in terms of what's going on in the world. I've also worked at the BIS, so I got to see how other central banks in the world looked at how an international institution operates. I was the chief economist for international affairs at the U.S. Treasury Department, so I was the primary advisor on foreign economic policy to the United States government and on dollar policy. Wow. And then, of course, I've worked across markets. I've worked in pretty much every single asset class, on the buy side, on the sell side. I've even, unsuccessfully launched my own macro hedge fund.
We celebrate that, Marvin.
Well, it's always a learning experience. It's one of the things where you learn the difference between managing risk and calling the market. Those are two different things. I don't think enough people realize how big that difference is. But it was a fantastic learning experience for me. Well,
that's why we want to talk to you. You're not just a policy wonk,
Yeah. So that's what I bring to the table. Is I have seen the market from literally every different direction. And so I see things about what's going on that I think a lot of other people miss.
Yeah.
And, you know, while I do have a very strong quantitative background, I tend to focus on trying to use economic theory and my understanding of how different policy institutions and market institutions operate to forecast what's going to happen in subjective terms. And I think that's very important in the economic environment we're dealing with right now.
And Marvin, two other similarities we have. I think you did your PhD at Berkeley in economics, right?
So I was an undergrad at Berkeley. I did my PhD at UC San Diego.
Oh, wow, even better. And then so basically,
it was great for surfing, I'll tell you that.
Oh God, I think that's one of the best cities in the U.S. But basically, we both lived in California, and now we're both in London. So I just thought it was a funny kind of coincidence that we had that same journey. So Marvin, I've said I had to actually. I've read so much of your stuff. It was really a challenge to try and chart a path forward on this. But I had outlined kind of my thoughts, and I wanted to start. So just to kind of get us to the end game. So I think one of your big, there's so many big things, but a big one, a meta theme is global entropy. Yes. And that a lot of the post-World War institutions and economic relationships and how we're all used to seeing the world and how it has played out and the volatility around that and the returns and the asset allocation may be abruptly changing. Yeah. And it may be a lot more fragile than you think. But I think you'd say that you just this has been underway for decades.
Yes.
And do you want to, before we get into China and Russia, do you want to say kind of like the meta themes that have been kind of nibbling away at this order and kind of why it's been fraying over time?
Yeah. So look, a lot of people will talk about the breakdown of the quote rules-based order or the post-war liberal order, and I have a theme, and all of my research is around specific themes. And one of the big themes is this one of global entropy. This idea that it's natural that any type of order tends toward disorder. That is the natural state of the universe. That's what entropy means. That's what physicists use it to describe what happens in any type of physical structure. You build a building, you leave it untended, it will fall apart. That's entropy. And we built this amazing order in the wake of World War II. But unless you tend it properly, it's going to break down. And, I think it was tended properly for a long time, but I think one of the things happen is that people start to think that this is permanent and this will never end. And that, the West would always be on top. Well, the rest of the world wasn't so keen on that idea. They signed up for our institutions when the US was the most powerful country out there. And it was also the only game in town in terms of its economy. But as those things start to erode through time, particularly on the military front, of course, that system that was entirely dependent on the US being the world's policeman breaks down when the US no longer has the capability to be that policeman. And that's what we've been seeing. So it's been in stages. I would say that, the US's sort of geopolitical credibility, its myth or it's everyone's belief that the US is the ideal standard, the city on the hill, sort of peaked with Gulf War I.
Yeah.
That was massively eroded during the Clinton administration and certainly the Bush administration. There was a huge loss of US prestige through both of those. I think militarily, it was clear that the US military peaked relative to all its peers in roughly the second Gulf War and the Iraq War. And you started to see increasingly different adversaries, whether they were non-state actors like ISIS or peer states like China, start to develop asymmetric capabilities and try and confront the US in ways that were not where the US had a clear advantage. And the crucial one there is really China, in terms of they effectively have redefined warfare. And I think, this may be a controversial statement, but I think it's very clear that China has been at war with the US for at least 30 years. They've been in an active state of war. They just define war differently. It's not just kinetic action, that is, using your military. It's using, economic means. It's using lawfare. It's using information warfare, all of these things. There has been an active strategy to undermine the US's ability to undertake war. And we're seeing that today in terms of, you have a instead of these limited conflicts against poorly funded terrorist organizations, you now have interstate warfare taking place in Ukraine, and also in Israel, Iran. And what is the problem the US is facing? It can't produce weapons fast enough. Why is that? Because over the last 30 years, the US allowed its industrial capacity to be degraded purposely by China, that has shifted most of world manufacturing to China. China is now responsible for 40% of world manufacturing. That wasn't an accident. And by the way, it's not because of cheap labor. It's all because of industrial strategy. I mean, if it was about cheap labor, Africa would be where we are. And it is absolutely a strategy. And so you go through these stages, and we are now at a stage where China is a realistic peer competitor in military terms. And that means the US cannot be the global policeman. So we're at this inflection point where it does get potentially very dangerous, that we could have serious interstate conflict between the US and China. And that is a threat to this order that has been slowly decaying, potentially collapsing. That's, I think, the big risk that people underestimate.
No, and this is you've kind of jumped to the the conclusion.
Sorry, I didn't.
But I was gonna say, I was like thinking there was like what kind of was setting the stage for this, and one was, you said, like, look, this kind of breakdown by the U.S. militarily, it starts to get involved in these wars and kind of losing them, and the more shifts becoming asymmetric, and we're kind of, so you have Iraq, Gulf War II, and Afghanistan, and as you said, the kind of warfare is changing a bit. A second one that you write about, which I thought was very interesting as well, is like on the global playing field of, where kind of countries are aligning themselves, and in China and Russia vying for influence, that some of these cultural things, and I've done a lot of work in Africa, and you wrote about Uganda, for example, and just that, like, recently, I see it more with Europe than with the US, but is this pushing of Western values tied to financial aid? Or, you want to deal with the World Bank, well, then you got to recognize ESG was a big one, right? And kind of this, I see with Africa, often they question, like, wow, you want us to jump right to renewable energy, but, we've got these oil reserves we'd like to monetize. And by the way, isn't it hypocritical that Norway, are telling us, after you've made $1 trillion, how we're supposed to not make any money off our oil, but you were allowed to, and we've got to do wind farm. And so your point is that, and I thought you said nice thing, that we kind of made this assumption, and we've increasingly been pushing Western values into the emerging markets, and there's a little bit of a resentment at that around that, and that actually China and Russia have been playing that up pretty well as just driving little wedges everywhere. Again, just kind of fracturing the post-world liberal order, as you said.
Yeah, this is a huge bit. It goes back to what I was saying about, you built this house, this edifice, the post-war liberal order, and you didn't tend it well, so it started to fall apart. And part of that is that you thought you had the nicest house on the street, and everybody wanted to live in your house. And actually, that's not true, because some people have very different tastes and very different values, and they don't like your house laid out the way it is. And yet there was this arrogance, and it really is arrogance. That's one of the reasons why I point out the decline in the perception of the U.S. as the pinnacle, the city on the hill, began really in the Clinton administration. And if you recall, Madeleine Albright, in justifying the war against Serbia, said, we have the right to do so because we are the indispensable nation. Really? Where's that written? Nobody else signed up for that, right? We're right because we are America. It was that arrogance. And if you see it, that pervaded everything. So as you say, now it's all those post-war institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, all these things, that they impose all, not just climate issues, but they impose all sorts of cultural issues too. And there's this, you always hear this term in the West, universal values. You go anywhere in the world, they don't know what those universal values are because they have different values. But the West is so arrogant that they think their values are everyone else's values. And while you were the biggest military and biggest economy in the world, people were willing to humor you in that. When you no longer are, and to exactly your point, when China is coming out and saying, hey, we'll give you a development loan, and we really don't care about your record on democracy or human rights or your views on sexual orientation or anything like that. We just want your commodities, and we want to trade, and we'll give you a loan for this. And then the West is coming along and saying, oh, well, we don't like actually your laws on homosexuality here. And that's no comment from my perspective.
Yeah, no.
We're going in, and in a lot of these cultures, that is an issue. We don't like the way you're using your resources. We don't like the way you're treating your labor. We don't like this. And you can only borrow this money if you do this and you adhere to our universal values that, of course, everybody accepts. And people are saying, we don't accept that. And so this has basically opened up the door for countries like China and Russia to come in and make inroads commercially and, most importantly, politically in many of these countries. And it really is a values and cultural warfare. And that's what I mean about the whole China's unrestricted warfare has been about opening up fronts that we don't usually think we compete on.
Yeah. And Marvin, you didn't go into it, but I read one of your pieces. You went into enormous study. There was some economists, or I guess, had done a study on values, and you were pointing out mathematically actually how far most countries are on a lot. Like, these universal values are not as universal, or the amount of countries that accept them as universal values is a lot narrower subset than you think.
Exactly.
And we're actually
so there's a massive data set called the World Values Survey. So they go out and they interview, I think, total number of interviews is something like 90,000 interviews around the world, and they're face-to-face interviews, and they ask them like 300 questions about how you feel about all different types of value issues on things. And so you can really map out what people's values are. And yeah, I just calculated the sort of mathematical distance between, the West and other countries. And what you do see is that most of the rest of the world is actually quite a ways away. What's really interesting is if you do those same calculations for China and for Russia, Russia actually seems to have a real advantage. Russia sort of sits in the middle in that they're not as far away from the West.
Yeah.
They're also close enough to a lot of these other countries, whereas China really does stand out as aberrant. They are not close to anyone either, but they are willing to accept everyone else's values as long as you play ball with them. And
Yeah.
that's what they're using. I will say there's a really interesting thing here. This is going to be a bit controversial maybe for some people. But, if you read any Western paper, you will get that, just nonstop derision of Donald Trump and discussion about how Donald Trump is undermining the US position globally in terms of foreign policy, that he's so turning off everybody. But the really interesting thing is that if you look at global polling, yes, Donald Trump has had a major negative impact on Westerners' view of the United States.
Mm.
The exact opposite for most of the world's population. In places like India, he has like an 85% approval rating.
Oh, wow.
Off the chart. Even China, it's like 60% approval rating. Everywhere else in the world that's not the West, they love Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so it's quite interesting that all the things that, as you said, the Europeans have really taken the lead on this whole values push. And that's one of the reasons why they're so rejecting Donald Trump. And yet that's actually an advantage in many of these other countries.
God, and Marvin, it's so interesting because this is a cultural war. It's a multi-level war. And I was just going to go now to the next thing, but you kind of mentioned it already, was that China has, we talk about the economic rise of China, but you said really this has been a kind of a military playbook. This is a national playbook, but on multiple fronts.
Yes.
The economy is one of them.
Yes.
Economy doing well, technology doing well. You said they took that, a lot of the principles, how Japan rapidly accelerated, mapped that to China. But it's not an accident that they are the global workshop, all these things.
And they're surging ahead in technology, right? Like if you look around, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute tracks 64 different critical technologies. And I can't remember what the numbers off my top of my head, but it's something like 55, 56 of those China is now considered the leader in. Okay. And so you got many people in the West thinking, the US is winning the technological war. It's not clear anymore. There's a lot of areas where it's very clear China is actually ahead. And that is part of the whole industrial policy. And I think this is something that too few people understand. They've always framed it as this is about economic efficiency and there's cheaper labor there. If you talk to anybody who has been doing business in China stopped being a cheap labor source back in the noughties, the early 2000s, right? It competes through cheap capital. And what it does is it suppresses consumption to create excess savings in the society. It has capital controls that trap that savings inside, and all that saving is directed through state banks into the industries that China feels are important for it to get ahead militarily. And they take this approach of just throwing capital at the problem and say, hey, just go do 1,000 different things. If you succeed, you can be Jack Ma and, be really rich, and don't get too powerful. We'll take it away from you then. Right. You can do great. If you fail, don't worry about it. These are non-recourse loans. We'll just have the banks eat these, put them in an asset management company and hide them away. Now, economically, that's terribly economically inefficient. But if you think about, if you are in a hurry to get somewhere quickly, this is a really effective way. You are basically letting 1,000 ideas bloom across your economy and saying, whichever one of you guys comes up with the best solution, you'll be the winner. The rest of you guys, we'll make you whole. You'll be fine. And so that one, creates persistent overcapacity, which is the phenomenon we see everywhere. That undermines your strategic competitor's industrial base, but it also means you move up that technological value curve super fast.
Yeah.
And that's the objective.
And then, so that's on the economic side. And we see that. Then we touched on the cultural piece where, they've kind of been building, now it's getting pretty overt, right? They're building counter, like the Belt and Road Initiative. What's the bank? They've created like their own version of the World Bank.
Yeah. Well, the
Asia Development Bank or something?
AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. So yeah.
And this BRICS meetings where they've just really building this alternative world to the United Nations and all these post-World War institutions that the West set up. And and then the final front, or maybe there are more, but like you talk about where they are militarily, that with all their missile technology, that they can really shut you down in the Pacific.
I think this is one of the things that is really not understood well enough, that if there were a war over Taiwan today, the US loses. It's not even a question in my mind. And the reason, that doesn't mean that China has the capability to project its force everywhere else around the world as effectively as the US does. But in the Western Pacific, they have absolute overwhelming dominance from land-based missiles that are increasingly precision missiles, have hypersonic re-entry glide vehicles that we would struggle to shoot down, which basically means that any large surface ship within, say, 2,000 miles of the coast, and that, that, by the way, gets out to Guam, the second island chain, any large surface ship they can take out. And then, that leaves the U.S. with basically the use of submarines. So we can probably interdict shipping into China, but there's not much else we can do there. And so I think that's kind of the whole game. And people haven't realized this, that we are much closer to the potential that China just does say, look, we're launching an embargo against Taiwan. What are you going to do about it? And
so this gets to where the next thing, which is you write about, is that while this decay or this entropy has been going on for decades and through the Gulf Wars and the Belt and Roads, that we've reached a what you think is that this is a kind of an inflection point on this, that on multiple levels, that I guess on the one hand, Russia has come out in a full front war on Ukraine, but also for China, that the US with Trump has really kind of really acknowledged that this, that there is so let me go back. The Ukraine war was an inflection point, you said, because I think everyone's saying is like, wow, the amount of munitions that get expended and how the new wars work. And in a war that lasts 3 years of this, we are not prepared for this. And like the amount of Tomahawk missiles we shoot at the Houthis is like a year, 18-month supply, I think you were saying, like, and on the US side has been this acknowledgement, and it's behind the tariff war, it's behind the CHIPS Act, is that actually, whoa, we have a strategic vulnerability here, that we don't manufacture much here. We don't control our supply chains. COVID was another reminder of this, and kind of like, whoa, we actually are in a bad spot. And so we need to start industrializing to build up for military reasons. Yeah. And you're saying that that's an inflection point, because that's also the clock is ticking, right? Well, you explain it, right? Because you said,
well, so I just made a statement that I'm sure there are various people out there who would disagree with, that were we to have a war over Taiwan today, China would surely win. I am 100% sure of that. I don't have a question that I don't even think it's a close call. But what is clear is that China is suffering from significant demographic decline, far faster than many other countries. It's really easy to get, or not really easy, because obviously not everybody's done it, but it's easier to get to the technological frontier of where everybody else is than it is to go beyond that. So, China's technological advantage, is not clearly going to the gap is not necessarily going to be in their favor going forward. And then to exactly the point that you raised, the West has started to wake up, that, wow, we're actually not prepared to fight an interstate war. We do not have the industrial capacity for that. They're going to start rebuilding. They already are. And that's going to take a decade or more. But that means that China has a narrowing window of clear outperformance in the Western Pacific. And if they're going to make a move for Taiwan, they're going to need to do it within that window. A variety of different military analyses have suggested that will be, their sort of advantage in terms of material and technologies and everything will be at its apex in about 2027, 2028. So that's always been the sort of forecast for when they'd make a move for Taiwan. But I think that, Donald Trump changes the calculus of that.
It's kind of like the clock is ticking and you have 5 years maybe where you have this, you have this real advantage, yes, industry, supply chains, and the problem is that, and the reason the clock is ticking is that everyone else finally woke up to this problem and they're working on it. So your best, if you want to do something, militarily, the time is now, or possibly in some ways, right?
Exactly. And I think so, and here's where the arguments sort of go both ways. And I tend to try not to be the proverbial two-handed economist.
No, it's okay.
But I think, one of the key points that's envelops this entire discussion and all these ideas is that we live in an age of increased uncertainty. That is, and I'm using Keynes's definition, which is risk that is non-quantifiable. So we don't know how to put a probability on this stuff. There's no way to estimate that, right? And so you do have to sort of think through scenario analysis on this hand, on that hand, and how do you develop an investment strategy that encompasses all of those scenarios. And so on one hand, I would say, look, China wants to win without fighting. This is very clear in their military doctrine elsewhere, is they want it to be so clear they're going to win that the other side just capitulates and says, yep, that's fine. And I think they're close to that point, but they'd like to get to their goal of, having such overwhelming force. And that's probably 2027, 2028. And if you think about that point about, Trump has gone around upsetting a lot of Western allies, they're probably thinking, hey, let's sit back and watch him destroy this himself and we'll be in an even better position. So there's that aspect that says they should wait. But then there's this other aspect that he's going around striking a bunch of trade deals. And one of the elements of those trade deals that doesn't seem to be talked about as much is that they are pushing to cut China out of trade with all these other countries. So they're actually formulating in hard economic terms and hard power terms a much tighter alliance with the United States. And at the same time, they are prioritizing reindustrializing the US as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Right? So that pushes you towards, well, hey, let's just go through it before this gets worse. So I do think it's a highly uncertain risk, but it has to be part of your investment thinking.
One other strategy that I think you put out there, which is actually I think is happening, is the kind of the global chaos strategy, right? And that is start so many fires around the world that you really stretch the U.S. thin, and it has a hard time deciding if it really wants to get involved in something like Taiwan. I think you're saying also that the global entropies just really set this stage for this, and so you have, all over the place. You've got the Houthis have shut down the Red Sea, and we can't do anything about it. We have Iran and Israel. We have Pakistan and India shooting stuff at each other. North Korea, South Korea is always bubbling around. And the more, as an investor, you could be, and I think your point is that Russia and China behind there are a little bit pushing the buttons and not minding, kind of would love to stoke more of these things. And especially maybe if they could get one going in South America, get something more in the Western hemisphere. But all these things.
Outside Venezuela, right? And
right.
Dispute with Guyana.
So you're like, look, as an investor, this is the Taiwan one is a mega one, and it's hard, but part of the prelude is we might have a lot of disruption going on.
Well, and this is one of the pieces I put out for free. So occasionally I put out free pieces at thematic markets that I think have a large public policy influence, and one of them, that I wrote right after the October 7th attacks in Israel was this global entropy piece, explaining how this all fit together, explaining those cultural differences, all of that. And the precipitant for that was this October 7th attack, and wow, they are opening up multiple fronts, and they are trying to purposely tie down the US in multiple places. And while there is definitely actions between China and Russia together, I think you have to recognize China is doing this with Russia. So I guess it was 2 weeks ago, something, a Chinese high representative was meeting with Kallas, the foreign minister of the EU, and they were talking about the Ukraine, and the EU was bringing up, we really want you to stop supplying Russia with all these munitions things, and the Chinese response was, we could, if we really wanted to, we could supply them so that the Ukraine war would be over in their favor tomorrow. They're holding back. They like the idea that this war is going on more because it's occupying the West, right? So you have to remember there are tensions between China and Russia as well, but absolutely the strategy is to get the US to commit itself in so many different places that China can then announce an embargo of Taiwan, and the US looks around and says, we can't stop this.
We got too much other stuff going on, and then I think you went into, just as a kind of, you went through the possible scenario, look, if there was a Taiwan attack, you're like, look, maybe let's say that China does an embargoes, blockades, naval blockade of Taiwan, which they, as you're saying, fully can execute.
Yes.
But then that the retaliation by the U.S. would probably be some greater blockade outside, shut down energy shipments into China and food. But then the rebuttal to that would be, well, if you're going to try and stop stuff coming into China, nothing's going to get to Korea or Japan either. And you're like, look, this issue of Taiwan could spill very quickly into a total shutdown of shipping in the Asia Pacific.
60% of global shipping and 60% of global commerce. I mean, it's a big deal. This would be the whole enchilada, as they say, in terms of in our old California days, and that's why you have to be thinking about it in your portfolio. And by the way, that's if the U.S. chooses to contest.
Right. Yeah. Right. Maybe it wouldn't. Right.
But think through the implications of if the US doesn't choose to contest it. Well, that is, we talked about this process of global entropy, of slow decline, and then maybe there's a precipitous fall. The US backing away from, it's never made a firm official commitment. It's always kept this ambiguous, but it's always assumed the US is going to do this. And basically saying, nope, we're ceding this to China now. That is a monumentous move in the global political order. I think is the final nail in the coffin of the post-war liberal order. And I think really does have serious implications for people's holdings of treasuries, other US assets, because there will be a reorientation of a lot of current US allies in the region towards China, because they're going to say, this is where the military power is.
Yeah. And so I was like, I think we're now at that point. I mean, you've just setting that stage for your geopolitical vega that, look, this has been building for decades.
Yes.
Multiple pieces are coming together. There is already, you don't need the global chaos, that there's multiple data points. Like that is, you can connect the dot. I think a lot of people can easily see the dots connected there. And you have this clock now kind of ticking where strategically China, it might behoove them to act sooner than later. And the consequences of this, and I kind of go, whoa, this kind of stuff blows your head, right? And you're like, but then I have to say, well, sheesh, think of all the terrible things that would happen to China and this and that, and they would be ostracized and this and that. But I have to appreciate, I did not think Putin would invade Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it's where you have to go, sheesh, these regimes and these governments are obviously not operating. The calculus is different than I got it wrong personally. And I'm like, okay, so I'm hesitant to say that China's wouldn't do something like that, right? So just to say that I think what you set up for people, and this is why you're like, look, this is actually, it's, as you say, it's an unknown, it's hard to know the probabilities, but they're much higher than we seem to think, or it seems to be expressed by anyone's positioning, anyone's discussion, and volatility in the market. And also, and as you said, like if something like Taiwan were to happen, the ramifications would be monumental. And yet, I think when things like this come across people's, they go, well, sheesh, if that happens, I don't know what to do. I mean, it's just going to be like, I will have bigger, they kind of almost throw up their hands. Like if something like that happens or a nuclear bomb goes off, I mean, I don't even know how I'm supposed to deal with that. I'm not going to even bother to think about it because the whole world would end. And, the tagline is usually, I would have bigger problems than whether I beat the S&P or something, so I don't, but what's cool about you, Marvin, is you actually said, well, no, these are actually significant risks that for many, many reasons are not unlikely at all. We're right. Actually, there's a real, they're kind of teed up very likely, or this is something we actually, it's risk. It's probable enough that we actually have to do work on how you would address this. And you did, one of the big things, and I have heard someone else say the same thing to me. They said, if China were to get into war or something, I don't even know how you would hedge it or what you would do. And I think after Ukraine, everyone also feels that way. They're like, maybe the correlations are going to be different than we think. Things that we thought would go up, maybe don't. And you did some work that maybe you can describe, like in how you maybe need to hedge a variety of things because there will be surprises. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what the correlations are going to be. It's a whole new world. The good news is volatility is super cheap. So any of these things, you can, it's good time to be doing this.
Well, so um, the process is one that I think you need to incorporate as on an ongoing basis if you're an asset manager or an active investor. And that is that you should have, because we're dealing with what I described as uncertainty, non-fundamental or not non-quantifiable risks. And to your point, you often don't know even what markets they're going to move. Or, by the way, remember that you're also dealing with risks you don't even know are on the menu, right?
Yeah.
So if you and I had this conversation back in December of 2019, and I said, guess what? You know what? 7.5 billion people are going to be under lockdown in 3 months.
Yes.
You would have thought I was nuts. You would have
Yes.
said, why did I book this guy? And yet it happened, right? So there are things that are potential that we don't even know about. And that's what's in the nature of uncertainty. So you should always have part of your portfolio as hedging that. And actually right now, because of all of the Trumpian induced volatility, the sort of vol of vol has gone up a lot.
Okay.
And it's harder to buy the wings right now. So
Okay.
last year I had advocated a portfolio approach. Hey, look through a bunch of different scenarios, come up with what are different things that you think could happen in each of those scenarios, and buy really cheap, long dated, out of the money insurance through option markets. And had you done that last year, you'd basically be able to go on vacation for the rest of the year now, because those things would have paid off. What I mean by this has to be an ongoing process is if someone's listening to this right now, that's going to be a really hard one to replicate right now. There are some interesting things out there that you could do, and we can talk about some of those. But I think right now, because the butterflies, the tail price of volatility is so high, you're much better off looking at more plain vanilla things and developing this strategy that as vol prices come down in the future, you start buying this as an ongoing portfolio process, right? And so, instead, right now, what can you do? Well, guess what? If we were going to have a war, you want to hold the assets of some place that will exist after the war. And I would say the country that is most secure in terms of it will continue to exist afterwards and it will continue to be an important part of the global economy is frankly the US. So people want to talk about the loss of US exceptionalism. No, the US has become a riskier place. It is still exceptional in that it, lives in its own continent behind two big beautiful oceans, as Donald Trump says.
Own energy source,
has all the resources in the world, has everything. It is exceptional by nature, not by nurture, right? And so there is going to be a flight to the dollar in that scenario. And guess what? You are actually paid. Usually, when you invest in a safe haven, it's got a lower yield than everything else. Right now, dollar assets are giving you a higher yield than even risk-off currencies like, say, the Australian dollar, much less versus Taiwan dollar. You can be long US dollars, short Taiwan dollars, and earning 3 percentage points of carry on that trade. And it's a hedge against things going badly. And the list is long of just being long dollar assets relative to other things. And you're actually being paid to hold this position right now. So that's the way I would approach it at this stage. And then as, tail volatility comes down, do start to look through a process of, effective scenario analysis to be able to strategically buy insurance and devote, say, 1% of your portfolio to buying insurance on super high leverage options, i.e. limited downside, you're only going to lose 1% of your portfolio at worst, but that thing could pay 20 to 30 times in a bad scenario, that's exactly what you want.
Marvin, I think this is good advice. And I also remember, kind of why it's interesting to me is I remember after the GFC, there was there's two stories I'll tell. One is that after the GFC, I remember black swan funds were very popular, right? Like, oh wow, we underappreciated this volatility and it can come out of nowhere, and so we should have part of our portfolio in these funds. And they were popular right after, but then they, over 10 years of nothing happening, I think people have been less interested in them and, more into like venture capital and taking 10-year bets on technology. And so no one wanted to pay that 1%. I think what's interesting is the timing, now might be one of those times again where it's actually, hey, let's do a little more work on this for our multi-billion-dollar portfolio on hedging this stuff, because this risk might be bigger than we think. And then just a second, just a little story, because it came to mind as you were talking about the cost of insurance. And I was at a hedge fund that was buying the subprime, was involved in the subprime trade. And I remember it was early, it got in 2005, thinking that there was going to be a housing, and it's just like to your thing, like housing hadn't gone down in like 80 years or whatever. So statistically, like people are like, why are you making this bet? It's never happened. Yeah. And that's a little bit what you're like, someone might say with this, you're kind of betting on a collapse of the post-world order, and you're like this, and the same way people like these real estate options were kind of underpriced, that actually this seemingly statistically impossible thing was actually the setup had been building for it actually to be quite likely. And that's kind of what you're saying with this, this is cooking, and the odds are, the market is not pricing in this risk as much as it actually is. And I remember we'd gone into this trade in 2005, and I think it might have been late 2006 or early 2000. We'd been in it like 2 years, and we were starting to grumble. Like everyone was around I think we'd paid Goldman Sachs like $50 million in option premium on this thing at this point. And I was like, how much we paid Goldman like $50 million, like, how big is this thing going to be when it happens? And is it really going to be worth it? And I remember our portfolio manager, our founder, John Burbank, it's just kind of like, he's like, I don't know, but it's going to be big. It was such an unscientific answer, he's like, they're like, are you sure that it's going to make up for the 50 that we spent? And he's like, is it going to be a big thing? And he's like, it's going to be big. So anyways, which it was. But
if I can just say on I mean, like I appreciate exactly what you're talking about. One thing is, go back to, if you did have a conflict over this, as I'm saying, something like 60% of the world's trade shuts down. That is a massive thing. And you think about, it's more than 60% of total LNG goes to Asia. So stop. So one of the few option trades I do think exists out there is actually, surprisingly downside in natural gas futures in Europe and the US, because if all your Asian clients are shut off to you, guess where all the natural gas in the world has to go? And so you could actually get negative natural gas prices in the
Marvin, that's so counterintuitive.
Exactly, but this is the type of stuff you have to be thinking about. And so the point is, I don't know how big it's going to be, but it's going to be big. And a lot of counterintuitive things like that are going to happen. Oh, by the way, who's been buying all the gold in the world? It's really only one central bank. It's China. So if they now need to use that as liquidity, is gold going to do what you expected it to do in that scenario? I'm not sure it does. It might, but I'm not sure it does. And then the other point I'd touch on is exactly what you said. You're talking about the breakdown in the world order that we've been living with for 80 years now. And I would just point out that we do have these inflection points roughly once a century. So the Napoleonic Wars, or the French Revolution more generally, was a massive inflection point in global markets. That was, 1792 through 1814. Then you had a relative period of stability in global markets because of the Pax Britannia, that provided freedom of navigation to the oceans, created globalization. Like everything you talk about today existed in the 1800s under the UK. In fact, I think actual global trade as a share of GDP was even bigger then. And then you had 1914 to 1945 interrupt that. Well, guess what? We're about a century through this. You should be thinking about this, to exactly your point about you think about these things at exactly the wrong time. Now is when you should be thinking about this.
Yeah. Marvin, that was fantastic, and I think super useful for people, and I hope it kind of just gets the conversation going, at a lot of investment committee meetings. And you're a great person and I want to say again, your Substack is Thematic Markets. I have been reading it for like the last 10 days. There is so much material there. And what I love about it is you're actually, as we said at the beginning, like you've been in macro markets, you know how options, you do some very in-depth work on options pricing and how you would do these things. So I recommend, if anyone, I mean, there's a lot there to read. There's the setup in global entropy. There's about the dragons. There's geopolitical Vega, where you start to talk about how you might build an options book around this. And then, of course, so just, let's say, read all of that, but then obviously get in touch with you if it, trying to do these options books like more than I could do.
I appreciate that, and this has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the conversation, Eric. So thank you for the opportunity to talk on these issues. And yeah, anybody who's interested, look up thematicmarkets.com or check it out on Substack, thematicmarkets.substack.com. I do also have a free. It's not my research. It's basically all my sort of contrarian ideas that I don't have time to research end up on a publication called Seriously Marvin. So you can check out that one too, just if you want it, if you were curious and wanted to learn more about it. But yeah, the detailed research and real serious market analysis is at Thematic Markets.
Marvin, that's excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, I'll stop.